Welcome to the SNN Network Canada virtual event. I'd like to introduce our next presenter, Neil Sweeney, founder and CEO of Reklaim. Neil, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much. Thanks everybody for taking some time out of your day to listen to the Reklaim presentation. I know you've probably all had a number of different presentations today, so I'll try to keep this pretty quick. This presentation can be found on our investor relations site as well, which can be found at reclaimyours.com/investorrelations. Reklaim is spelt with a K. A couple quick things. Reklaim trades on both the Vancouver Exchange under the symbol MYID, as well as on the OTCQB under the symbol MYIDF, F standing for foreign. So I'll take you through the philosophy and the mission of what we're trying to do here, and then please, if you have any questions, feel free to type them in, and I will either pick them up in flow of the presentation, or I'll answer them at the end. Feel free to also reach out to me directly at neil@reclaimyours.com if you want to have any other follow-up information. So the philosophy of Reklaim is quite simple. This was a company that's been in market now for a few years. For context, it was incubated inside of my previous company, which is a company called Freckle. For some context, I've been building companies now in the data and marketing space now for over 20 years. What we're trying to do here really at Reklaim is that, as you can likely appreciate, you as a consumer have a data profile. The problem with that is that you as a consumer don't have any access to your data profile, which is a bit strange considering it's a $500 billion a year market, and that every company in the world actually collects your data, uses your data to power their business, and many of these companies are actually selling your data. On average, the individual's data profile is worth approximately $6,000 per year, of which you're getting zero. The value of that profile continues to increase by approximately 30%. So what we felt the gap in the market was, why can't you as a consumer access your data? Can we build a front door or a portal to allow consumers from around the world to come to an ecosystem, validate who they say they are, and then provide them with visibility and transparency on all the data that's currently in the marketplace today? That's exactly what we're doing here at Reklaim. So if you come to the Reklaim ecosystem today, you would put in a phone number, an email address, or multiple email addresses. What we do with that is, after you validated you are who you say you are through two-factor authentication, we then scan over 30,000 individual sources of data. These range from security firms, data companies, publishers, etc., to see what data is currently available in the market. That's important because we're the only company in the world that's providing that transparency and visibility on your data. With that notion of providing you access to your data, which we think is the larger gap in the market, no consumer has access. By providing this action, we then give you an opportunity to create a Reklaim account and put that data underneath, your control. With that control, you now have options. The options have historically been that you can pick and choose which data you would like to sell. The more data that you share, the more data you can sell, the more money you can make. Consumers today are making upwards to $10 per month, sharing things such as age, gender, and behavioral individual attributes. I'll get later on in the presentation a little bit about what we're introducing, but I think the important thing to understand is right now we believe Reklaim is the only ecosystem in the world today that is providing consumers with access to their data and that optionality around it. So while we're headquartered in New York, we also have an additional office in Toronto. We are providing how we make money as an individual company is that we're offering compliant consumer data to brands, platforms, and data companies. These companies increasingly need compliant data in order to power their business. Because we have one-by-one consent with the individual user in our ecosystem, we feel that we stand to benefit from the larger transition that's taking place in the market where brands and companies are being required to actually have compliant data. So a quick couple of little housekeeping items regarding the capital structure. So there's about 67 million shares outstanding. Very few options, no debt. This is a very tightly held company, 45 to 50% insider ownership. I'm by far and away the largest shareholder. That should give you some comfort because as an investor, if you're investing in Reklaim, you're investing alongside me. So I stand to benefit and lose as much as anybody else. As mentioned before, we trade on both the QB and the venture. There's no debt, no cheap paper sitting underneath it. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about what's important about this business and how we actually can make money. So as I mentioned earlier, let's go back one slide. As I mentioned earlier, the data market is currently in the process of a much larger shift. And so historically, the way data has been bought and sold is that large companies accumulate data passively, unbeknownst to the consumer, and then arbitrage it to as many different people as possible. This is changing, primarily due initially starting with things like privacy law, which you might have been aware of in places like Europe and now in California as well. But every country, state, and province really is now changing their privacy laws to include the consumer. And that's a dramatic shift from what's historically happened. And the downstream impact of this is that anybody that has been using data up until now is required to find a new supplier, and that supplier needs to be able to demonstrate that they have consent. So if you're a data company that cannot kind of demonstrate consent, you're going to struggle. So for us specifically at Kili, because we have one-by-one interaction with the individual consumers, we have one-by-one consent. And so all the companies in the market today that are looking to replace their current suppliers, we stand to benefit from that. The second component that's actually happening in the market today is that companies like Apple and Google are making pretty dramatic changes into their own ecosystems. Apple, if you're an Apple user, you're probably aware of there being increasingly more privacy and less data leaking from that device. Historically, you would have seen when opening an application a prompt as to whether or not you'd be willing to share this data or allow yourself to be tracked amongst other applications. Current statistics would suggest that 90% of consumers actually don't want to be tracked. That's an important qualifier because that means that data is actually not going to be available in the market, whereas historically it had been. This is already happening today. You'll see this amongst a larger Fortune 500 companies who in Q4 and Q3 have been kind of presenting that, their revenue numbers are going down due to changes in privacy as it relates to Apple. The important thing to take away from this is just the beginning. It's only going to get worse. Google is eliminating the cookie next year, which 65% of the internet actually relies on. That's going to force any of the 2 billion individual publishers that are in the market to find a new supplier. So why I give you all this context is that there's these 4 macro trends. Not only is there more consumer awareness around their data, there's privacy legislation, which is inflecting, and then there's changes in Apple and Google, all of which that are driving people towards a product like Reklaim to actually capitalize. So for us on the sales side of the equation, the question might be, how do you guys make money and how do you stand to benefit? Currently inside of Reklaim, there's about 125 million accounts, and accounts are Reklaim users. Those are people that we have one-by-one interaction with. Important to note is we're not TikTok, so we do not have 125 million daily active users, nor will we ever. We like to position ourselves as the Credit Karma of consumer data, where if you think about it today, you can actually go to Credit Karma and query your credit score and then gain access to it, but that's not something that you're interacting with every day. The similarity there is today there's no place for you to go to actually see your consumer data except at Reklaim. So by coming to Reklaim, you can see the data that's currently there. You can option off of that data. You could be compensated, opt out, so on and so forth. And so we're currently increasing scale on those users by about approximately 1 million per week, and we do that through a variety of channels, including IVR, peer-to-peer texting, social, email, and others. Important to note, though, as it relates to selling data, you'll hear a lot of companies talking about this notion of you should get paid for your data. And while technically true, there's some limitations sort of around that. One thing for us is that we don't depend on things like surveys for our data. Our data sits in 15 of the largest enterprise-level data companies. It's in these data companies that the Fortune 500 buy their data. The best way to think about these companies like a LiveRamp, a Lotame, an Oracle, and so on and so forth, they're the Walmarts of data. And so for every integration that you have a higher opportunity to actually drive more revenue. So you have to have distribution if you'd like to sell data, and you have to have scale. We have scale, as I mentioned, 125 million accounts, 15 different global distribution partners, and the uniqueness of our data is unmatched in the sense that we're the only kind of consumer-facing portal in the space. So just how does that sort of translate into kind of what we've been doing specifically from a product point of view? Currently, as I mentioned, there's 125 million that has been reclaimed, but we have 3 times as this. And this change in the disparity between these two really changes based on, when a net new user comes into the ecosystem and reclaims their data. We've grown this for some context. In Q1 of 2020, we had probably about 10,000 users. We were a brand new company at that time. You've gone from 10,000 users to a backlog of 320 million. We don't need any more data inside of this business to grow this revenue 10, 20, 30, 40, 50x. Simultaneous to growing the actual scale of the individual profiles, we've actually scaled the distribution partners today to be 15. Each one of these individual platforms is a business unto itself. You could generate millions of dollars in a singular platform per year. So we're just beginning to start to actually realize some of the actual benefits associated to this. From a revenue point of view, we tend to focus on really 3 verticals, so brands and agencies. So think about Hasbro or Microsoft. These are companies today that actually use data to inform the media that they're buying in market. Nobody buys advertising. That's a misconception. Everybody buys data. If you actually want to advertise someone, you actually buy the data first, and then the actual advertisement becomes a manifestation of that data. So if you're trying to find somebody who's in market for a laptop, you use the data to target that person. As I had mentioned earlier, there's challenges in the market regarding supply with those changes I mentioned regarding Google, Apple, and compliance. This is forcing major brands to come into the actual market to find new suppliers, and we're starting to actually benefit from this by actually adding additional users. You'll see in the next slide that since the beginning of the year till now, we've grown our client base by about 130%. In Q3 alone, as you'll see in the later slide as well, we've grown our revenue about 1,500%. So the revenue model is starting to scale. Platforms are what I mentioned earlier, is that those are those distribution points. They take a little bit longer to get going because you have to actually do a technical integration, but they tend to be always on, and they provide discovery of your data to thousands of individual brands. So just being in one platform gives you exposure to thousands of different clients. As I mentioned before, we're integrated into 15 of those platforms. And then the last vertical that we work on is data. And in this, what we do for clients is that we supply them with usually 3 different types of data. Either a company has data, but they don't have consent. They come to us to actually provide them with consent on their data because we can manage that, because we have the interaction with the consumer. They're looking for fidelity. They might have an email address, but they don't have age and gender. We can provide that to them. Or they might be looking for a new identifier. They might have a cookie or a mobile ID, and these things are under pressure, and they might want to offset that risk. A client can take 1, 2, or all 3 of those. Those contracts are all current, are all always on, and they're reoccurring. So for context, most of you will be familiar with a company like Nielsen. Power is probably the biggest television portal. We supply data into Nielsen on a reoccurring basis. The more data you supply to them, the more money you actually make. So how this is manifested into sort of some of the brands and the individual platforms, I'm not going to go through each of these, but you can get a sense for who's here. Xandr is a platform that's owned by AT&T. Pubmatic is actually a publicly traded company. So is Reliant. T-Mobile, we're all familiar with them. LiveAmp is a publicly traded company, and MediaMath is an independent DSP. TrueOptic is actually a division of TransUnion. So every single one of these brands is representative of where we're actually continuing to place Reklaim data. I've gone through this, and I think this is an important piece, is that I've said this over and over, is that people who want to drive revenue in the data space, you can't do that unless you have scale and distribution. We spent the majority of last year kind of building that scale and distribution, and now we're starting, while it's early innings, we're starting to capitalize really on that actual scale. So year over year, beginning of the year, the number of brands that we're working with is up to 75%, which is up to 75, which is 127% year over year growth. And this is starting to actually starting to translate into real revenue for us. And I'll just kind of quickly go through some of the top line metrics for Q3 because I know this is important. So I appreciate that everybody wants to fixate on the revenue line, but I will reiterate, if you don't have scale and distribution, your revenue line is going nowhere. So for us, we built the scale and distribution, and now we're starting to actually see the benefits of this. So our Q3 sales were up 70% in Q3 from Q2 of this year. They're up 1,500% from Q3 last year. The total number of clients was up 127% year over year. We've expanded to 320 million total million accounts, up from approximately 10,000 the previous year. And importantly is that we rebranded the company as Reklaim. Some of you might be familiar with it as Killy in Q3. And we did that to really sort of align our vision of being a consumer portal to access data. One of the things that I do think is important for everybody to be conscious of, because what's new and what's coming, is this introduction of a new revenue model for us, which is a SaaS-based privacy tier. And the context here is simple. We believe that if you are a business that is entirely dependent upon selling data, you can only satisfy a subset of the individual population. We don't believe that that's our mission. We believe our mission should be to provide a product that satisfies every consumer on the planet. And if that's the case, it can't just be based on compensation. So for us, where we've iterated is that we believe that the vision here is let's provide access to consumers and then get out of the way and let them do what they want to do with their data. Historically, the only option available to consumers inside of Reklaim, or the previous iteration of Reklaim at Kili, was that you could only sell your data. And if you didn't want to sell your data, there was really no utility in this product. Well, now no longer, because the introduction of the privacy tier is a secondary option for a net new consumer or consumers that are currently in the product. Inside of the privacy tier, if you do not want to actually sell data, which is directly correlated to people's wealth, education, income, and assets, what's the utility of actual Reklaim? Well, inside of Reklaim, you can actually sign up for a privacy product that encrypts all the data that leaks from any of your individual devices, up to 6 different devices. It gives you password and data breach protection. It gives you a universal opt-out or a do not track. Why is this important? Is because in the first iteration of Reklaim, as I mentioned before, we reach out into the market and we bring you back all the data that's there. But if you open a device, phone, tablet, etc., you're going to leak new data into the market, which now you're in this game of whack-a-mole where you're consistently, populating new data into the market. With the introduction of the privacy tier, we're encrypting data, so no net new data is leaking into the market. So first version was we reclaim your data. Second version is we're not allowing you to actually have any net new data go into the market. And we think that this is a really important piece for us. This is a very high margin product, 65+% margin, reoccurring revenue. It brings a completely new user into the marketplace. And so we're pretty confident that, the privacy tier is going to equal the revenue tier in 2001. And as I mentioned earlier, with the revenue line growing as quickly as it is on the compensation side, you're getting the benefit of a brand new revenue line that's not really factored into kind of anything that we've done. So we think that the combination of privacy and compensation really is foundational to supporting this notion of providing consumers with access and optionality really around their data. So, with that in mind, just to kind of quickly wrap up here, I would encourage, anybody to go to our investor relations site. Just for context, Reklaim was featured in the Wall Street Journal this past Sunday as a company that's sort of leading the charge as it relates to optionality around individual consumers and their data. But this is a $245 billion market in the U.S. alone. The statistics are $400 billion globally. I think it's 2 times that. We have more scale and more distribution really than anybody else. The cap structure of this company is really tight. We have distribution both in Canada as well as the QB. We've got validation of our business. 15 of the largest data firms in the world don't integrate your data if you don't know what you're doing. That's not a trivial thing. People don't roll out of bed and just integrate into the 15 biggest platforms in the world. And we've also validated with companies like Microsoft, Nielsen, Hasbro, and others, and increasingly more so, that our data is good, performs, and is actually a solution to what they're doing kind of longer term. So it's a tight stock. At the very beginning, we think it's really poised to do quite well. So I would encourage you I would encourage you to continue to follow the stock, and if you're not part of it, to invest in it. Just quickly, a couple of quick questions regarding forecasting where we see the company in the next couple of years, and as a growth company, what will spark even greater market awareness. Regarding market awareness, with the introduction of the privacy, we do have a traditional growth metric where the average, and I'll just use rough math, if the average revenue per user for the privacy tier is approximately $100, you can drive growth through advertising underneath that $100, and as long as you're acquiring a net new user into that SaaS-based product at arbitrarily less than $100, then you're going to be cash flow positive. We have a similar product on the compensation side. Then we think that driving growth both on the privacy side and through what we're doing on the compensation side will increase the overall awareness. But we do think that by being a product that's not just based on compensation and is a combination of both compensation and privacy, that we will be able to attract a ton of different users. So we we think that we're at the beginning stages of our growth. We have aspirations to get up onto the NASDAQ at some point, but as of now, we've kind of got our heads down, and we're really just doing the work to really grow the revenue. So with that, I'll leave it there. Thanks so much for everybody for joining this quick presentation.
That concludes today's presentation. Thank you for tuning in.